The maps in Black Ops 6 are a hot topic right now, and most people would describe them as forgettable. But what about the overlooked maps in other installments? I'm Ornery, and today we're going through the most forgotten maps in every Call of Duty. To be forgotten, a map usually lies somewhere in the neighborhood between not very good and not very bad, but it is situational to the game, as you'll see in this video. The only criteria I have is that it has to be a launch map. There's going to be absolutely no DLC or like the free updates in the post-launch afterwards. But go ahead and comment what you think the most underrated map in Call of Duty is. The really early entries in the COD franchise are kind of tricky for a few reasons. One being a lot of the new generation didn't have a chance to play these games, and two, those that did play had a pretty solid overall selection to choose from with basically all of these early installments. So sorry if I step on some toes with the first few. For Call of Duty 4, I have to go with Downpour, but unfortunately to me, the rain is what held it back from being memorable. Ironically enough, it wasn't the vision that was distracting, but the sound. It just felt like it was there and it just like didn't stop. It was almost like white noise that would put you to sleep, but was also really distracting. And to me, that's what made it forgettable. And once again, forgettable doesn't necessarily always mean bad, and I think that's the case here. World at War had some maps that had tanks present that anyone could pilot. Some might argue that tanks in and of themselves were forgotten in World at War. But one of these tanks maps was Outskirts. And once again, this is the early days of COD, so if you played them, they definitely weren't forgettable because of nostalgia. But I'm really putting this here solely because it's a tank map. It was on the larger side, but might I say this is actually a really good map for the War game mode, which is also one of the greatest things about World at War. I think another case for World at War maps that doesn't really help its cause is that every map kind of looks the same in a way, and Outskirts really just didn't stand out aesthetically speaking. From the lighting, the settings, and honestly like assets in general, all of them look nearly identical. This one was extra hard because one, Modern Warfare 2 has an iconic map pool to choose from, but also literally every single one of these launch maps were also launch maps for Modern Warfare 3 in 2023. So that certainly doesn't help narrow it down. But I decided on Rundown because this just felt like it was overshadowed by a ton of masterpieces. And before you get mad at me for not putting Derail here, that's recognized as one of the most hated maps in this game. And since it's the most hated, that only draws more attention to it, which is the complete opposite of this video. Rundown was a pretty decent map for streaks, which made it a good map, but outside of that, it was most likely going to get the old vote to skip by the lobby. Crisis probably leans a little more towards bad than good, and was also just way too big to be in a game like Black Ops 1. This is one of those maps that kind of had too much going on, was really only good for ground war. The beachside jungle setting was really cool, but I think the spawn that actually had a building was just way better and overall resulted in an extremely awkward map. The control room over to the side was also awkwardly large for no reason. Didn't really feel like it just fit in the map naturally. However, I felt like they almost put this map in the game for private match games like Michael Myers because it functions very well for those. But pretty much nothing else. MW3 I've expressed as one of my all-time favorite multiplayers in the franchise, but it is definitely lacking in the maps department. For that reason alone, this was another hard choice, but I ultimately went with Seatown. This is one of my more favorite maps in this game, but I feel like a lot of people just don't talk about it. A pretty traditional 3-lane map with some nice little buildings sprinkled throughout, which make it like not the best for kill streaks, which turn a lot of people off. The map seemed like it would get a lot of use in the Infected game mode, and like Crisis, worked very well for that. Maybe it's just me, but it really felt like this was like only one of 3 maps from Infected. Like I have a lot of Infected memories on this map. Drone is one of those maps that feels like a black sheep in the game that it's present in. Black Ops 2 introduced a ton of fan favorites, and I would argue there's like way more good maps than bad maps. And that being known, when you get a map like Drone that was sort of middle of the pack, you would probably vote to skip since your chances of getting a masterpiece instead were pretty high. Drone kind of reminds me of Black Ops 1 and Crisis because it has that forest jungle vibe with a facility. And even aside from that, you still have those awkward buildings that kind of feel like it should be either all outside or all inside. Just kind of suffers from an identity crisis. No pun intended. Ghost has a pretty weak selection of maps, and some even go as far as the whole entire game is forgettable, even though I would tend to disagree with that statement. But there was a common theme with the map pool, and that was that Ghost had some of the biggest maps in the franchise for absolutely no reason, and Prison Break was no different. I promise I didn't do this on purpose, but this is another outpost in the middle of the jungle, and for some reason that just always ends up being a forgotten map. Maybe I have some subliminal disregard for jungle maps, but this one just felt like I never played it. In all honesty, you could probably replace this entry with any map from Ghosts, aside from Warhawk, Strike Zone, Freefall, Octane, and even Stonehaven, just because of how notoriously bad that map was. Gonna be completely honest and transparent with you guys in this next one, I barely played any of Advanced Warfare. That being said, pretty much all the maps in this game were forgettable because I barely knew any of them. And I can definitely tell you, I do not remember the map Instinct whatsoever. I don't have much to say about this other than I couldn't tell you why an ancient temple turned into a worksite excavation site exists, because I also didn't even play the campaign. Jetpack COD multiplayer just wasn't it for me, so I was definitely taking a back seat at the time. So if you think there's a better option for Advanced Warfare, please let me know down below. Of the 3 jetpack games, Black Ops 3 definitely takes the cake for my favorite. And Black Ops 3 had some good maps, but since they were designed for not only jetpacks, but wall running as well, I think they're almost treated completely different than standard maps. And Exodus was one of the few maps that I feel like could actually exist in any other Call of Duty that wasn't a jetpack game, and somehow feel natural without feeling like awkward or clunky. I seriously don't think I remember a single wall run spot on this map. For that reason alone, it didn't feel like it belonged in this game, and since it didn't showcase the jetpack movement, I think for a lot of people it was forgettable. But put it in literally any other non-jetpack Call of Duty and you might have something great on your hands. Just like Advanced Warfare, I don't have much experience with Infinite Warfare's multiplayer. Zombies in Spaceland had a death grip on me for this game's entirety, but I'm really just blindly throwing a dart here and it's gonna land on Grounded. I seriously don't think I've ever played this map, so I have absolutely nothing to say about it. So once again, if you think there's a better option for this entry, go ahead and drop it, because I'll be the first to admit I know next to nothing about this game's multiplayer. I actually played a lot of World War II, but if I'm being honest, I was strictly a war mode player. This meant any core map knowledge is extremely limited, if non-existent. So since I haven't played a lot of these maps more than once, I'm just gonna go with the most hated for this entry, being Gustav Cannon. This is objectively one of the worst maps in Call of Duty history because the crane, or whatever you want to call this structure, had sight lines over the entire map and gave whoever had this position secured control over the entire game. Maybe this idea would work better in a game like Halo, but this one is just flawed with poor design that everybody hated. Another one of my lesser played COD multiplayers, Black Ops 4 actually had some decent map design, but since I wasn't sold on the multiplayer, my experience with the maps were limited. Payload, however, is a map that vaguely reminded me of Summit at a first glance, but upon further gameplay is just a very stale map that I think has some really awkward open spots and then some even like more awkward tight spots. I almost want to put like the Blackout map in this entry because one, that's what I was playing the most at this time, and if you want to lump those in with like the Warzone maps, I would consider it way more forgettable, so like slight honorable mention to the Blackout map. Modern Warfare 19 may have had the worst lineup of launch maps, and that's mainly because of the super controversial decision to stray away from the 3-lane template that works so well. So all of these launch maps are forgettable, to be frank. But Grazna raid has to take the cake for one that was hateable enough to be disliked, but overshadowed by even more hatred. Normally, entries on this list are overshadowed by something better, but there was so much hate going on in this game that being a mid-map was going to keep you off that radar. There was a lot of awkward space in each spawn on this map that felt really unused and just incentivized camping, which really just turned into this whole game's identity. But like I said, I don't even think this came close to the worst of the worst at the time. I mean, this is the same game that had Euphrates Bridge and Piccadilly. I mean, those are two of the worst maps in Call of Duty history. So I'll give Grazna raid a little pass here. This is probably my all-time favorite setting for a Call of Duty map. Cartel and Cold War was set in a cartel operation, which I wish we saw more of this kind of thing, kind of like these like non-military operations. Outside of that, I also think that Cartel is a pretty solid map, but for some reason is way overhated. It's a somewhat true 3-lane map with a very open layout, and I think what people don't like about it was the watchtower, and it kind of gave you sightline over the entire map like Gustav Cannon did. But since this is a live service game, there was a lot of maps to come after this, and since it wasn't popular at launch, it certainly wasn't popular post-launch. But I did have a ton of fun memories playing prop hunt on this map. I feel like it's also one of those maps that just worked good for those like private match custom games and whatnot. Yet another Call of Duty that I seriously don't think I played any multiplayer outside of the launch window for this game. And also when I was playing this game's multiplayer, I was playing Champions Hill. Anyways, if you told me that this Desert Siege map was in the game at launch, I legit would have no reaction to that statement, because I genuinely think this is my first time ever seeing this map in any type of gameplay. Usually with any Call of Duty multiplayer map, I at least have somewhat of an area code, or can at the very least have a very, very deep, vague memory in the absolute recesses of my brain of it. But for this map, I'm completely drawing blanks. You could tell me this map is like a fever dream and I'd believe you. Probably one of the darker eras for Call of Duty. I was only playing Warzone around this time, and even that was a stretch to say. I actually played this multiplayer probably around the double amount of the time I played the Vanguard multiplayer, and if I'm being honest, there were some decent maps in this game, all things considered, but just was unfortunately attached to one of the worst Call of Duty experiences of all time. But one of the more mid entries in this game was Taraq. I enjoy this map, but I probably only played this within that launch window, and I also think there were several maps that were way better, and also a handful of maps that were even way worse. Taraq had a pretty chaotic and close quarters middle lane, but then the other sides were much more open and focused on long range engagements. Just like all the other live service games, this would get tons of maps after the fact to help bury Taraq once and for all. But if I'm being honest, in some weird way, I feel like the post-launch maps from Modern Warfare 2 might be more forgettable than the launch maps, even though they were free and like everyone had access to them. We all know that Modern Warfare 3 launched with the exact same 16 launch maps from the original Modern Warfare 2, and this makes it even harder to decide which of those maps are forgotten since we already established these maps are iconic. But here we are now getting a refresher. I don't want to use Rundown again because I think that's just sort of cheap and lame, so I'm just going to pick another lackluster map, and that's going to be Underpass. Similar to Downpour, I hated the rain and gloomy vibe going on here. Although the rain wasn't nearly as distracting as it was in Call of Duty 4, I think this map played very awkwardly. Like, both far lanes of this map just felt very isolated and disconnected from the rest of the map, and there wasn't any like natural bridge to get back into the center lane, which I really didn't enjoy. Once again, if you think there's a better option for Modern Warfare 3, I'd love to hear y'all's take because this one was just really hard for me. And now we're at Black Ops 6, where we have a very hated lineup of launch maps, so I think eventually they will all be forgettable, except for maybe Stakeout, and I think if the camo grind didn't exist, I think people would actually probably hate this map too somehow, just because we are like the most insufferable fan base. However, if I had to choose one extremely forgettable map, it's definitely Lowtown, and that's because it is objectively the worst. And since we can vote against it, I rarely find myself playing this map, and I wish I could never play this again for the rest of Black Ops 6, which looks like I probably won't have to. But that's the most forgotten map in every Call of Duty. If you think there's a better entry for some of the games, please drop your list down below, or like for a specific game, I would love to hear y'all's thoughts, especially on my lesser played Call of Duties. If you want to hear the most forgotten gun in Call of Duty, or hear me rant about if live service ruined Call of Duty, go ahead and click on screen now. Join my Discord if you're feeling crazy, and if you liked, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike, and thank you so much for watching.